So first, I'm actually going to take you guys a step back in time. And so this is just a snapshot of 1905. And a lot of the diseases that we now kind of consider to be exotic or not regularly found in Florida used to be found here all the time. Things like yellow fever, malaria, dengue. If I had this many dengue case numbers nowadays, I would be panicking. So, the Florida Department of Health actually was initially created in response to yellow fever, which is very interesting. And hopefully that building looks familiar for some of you guys. And so what happened since then? So we're not spending as much time outside as we used to. We're having things like windows on our doors, our screens and screens on our windows and doors. There we go. The use of mosquito nets at night back in the day, removing those mosquito breeding sites. Mosquito control agencies were kind of enacted in Florida quite a long time ago. The use of air conditioning, things like that. We're just not spending as much time outside. And then DDT did a lot for us too. Not good for the environment, but it did help us out until about 1972. And there's just some pictures of habitat modification and spraying from back in the day to reduce those mosquito populations. So why do we even conduct surveillance? Our goal is to prevent those large disease outbreaks, those numbers that we saw from 1905. And in order to do that, we need to target our control activities to the appropriate place, time, and population. So you need to know where your activity is, you need to know when it is, and who it's impacting. And control could be the things that we think of as traditional mosquito control, using larvicide to reduce mosquito populations by killing mosquito larvae, or adulticide to kill those mosquitoes, pesky mosquitoes that are flying around. But it could also be just increasing awareness in the medical community and in the public. And of course, you have your own personal protective measures that you can take as well, wearing the insect repellent, long sleeves, long pants. You guys all know the drill. So that's kind of the real reason why we do what we do. And so I'm not on the lab side. My lab stuff was all grad school way back in the day, so don't kick me out of your club. But I serve as kind of the person who is reviewing all of the mosquito-borne disease surveillance data in the state of Florida and reviewing all of the human cases and things like that and putting it out to the public. Can anyone kind of just hazard a guess of how many arboviruses, so viruses transmitted by mosquitoes, there are worldwide that can impact people? Just a random guess. I think I heard 100. Yeah, it's a little higher that we know of, I should say. A little, definitely lower. I really hope it's not 1,000. It's about 150 or so. And so this is really just an example of a handful of them. And in most cases, things tend to just be a plane ride away nowadays. So there's certainly a lot more that we need to kind of have in our minds, but not necessarily things that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And I actually need to add Oropouche virus to this slide, but did not have time to do that. Oh, wait, it is there. Good, I did. I snuck it in. Don't tell anyone. So with these mosquito-borne pathogens, in Florida, we really care the most about these 3 different virus families, and then malaria, which is, of course, a parasite. So the flaviviruses are things like West Nile virus, which I'll be talking about today, St. Louis encephalitis virus, which I won't be. And then for the alpha viruses, Eastern equine encephalitis virus, there's also something called Everglades virus, which we actually don't really test for. And then Highlands J virus, which doesn't cause any sort of clinical illness, but can be a good indicator of arbovirus transmission. And so the ones that are orange on this slide are the ones that are not normally found in the United States or in Florida. But we do have the right species of mosquitoes, or in the case of Oropouche, mosquitoes and midges, where we could have local transmission, where you have, say, a person who's traveling abroad, comes back, gets bitten by one of these vectors locally, and then you can subsequently have local transmission. Those are the ones we want to avoid. And going into those transmission cycles a little bit more. So for things like West Nile virus, Triple E, SLE, it really is maintained in this enzootic cycle where the virus is being transmitted back and forth between mosquitoes and birds. So birds are serving as the source of the virus. And it's really those species of mosquitoes that maybe have a broader feeding preference. Maybe they like people, maybe they like birds, maybe they like deer. And those are really the ones that are going to transmit it and allow it to escape from this kind of cycle between birds and mosquitoes and spill over into people. And people actually don't have enough virus in their blood to then go on and infect mosquitoes. So we're kind of considered to be dead-end hosts. That's in contrast to things like dengue, chikungunya, Zika, where people are serving as the source of the virus. So we have enough virus in our blood to go on and infect mosquitoes. And in Florida, it would be primarily Aedes aegypti. Those are the ones that are the hardest because we can have that local transmission. The enzootic ones are actually the hardest to get rid of because once it's in your animal population, good luck. And so we actually use a lot of different methods to try to kind of identify activity of these different types of viruses. And what I have shown here on the slide is really more for those endemic, the ones that are normally found in here. So things like looking for human cases, thanks to the testing that the providers at your facilities order and things like that. Because we have Eastern equine encephalitis virus and West Nile virus, they can actually greatly impact horses. So animal cases are actually also required to be reported to the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. We also have a sentinel chicken surveillance program, and I've got a picture of that later on. But essentially, there's chickens in cages in many different mosquito control programs, put them out throughout the state of Florida, and we screen their blood on a weekly basis looking for these, again, targeting that mosquito bird part of the cycle. Then sometimes we'll be looking at dead bird reports. Could this have been something like West Nile virus, which can cause large die-offs in birds? In some cases, we may be doing testing of mosquitoes. That's kind of our least amount of stuff that we do in terms of surveillance, just because if we started testing for mosquitoes, we would never stop. There are a lot of mosquitoes here in Florida. And then that last one, sometimes maybe we're doing testing for zoo animals or things like that, where they have had that risk of exposure and are symptomatic. And the type of surveillance we do really is targeting different parts of not only that transmission cycle, but just kind of the natural ecology and flow in time of when these diseases are transmitted. So if you have something that's going back and forth between birds and mosquitoes, the first thing we would expect to see are the dead birds. After that, we would hopefully pick it up in our chickens. Our chickens are not statewide. And then you'd have to have a high enough burden in the mosquitoes to really pick it up in mosquitoes. Later on, as activity increases, that's when you start to see the veterinary cases. Can anybody guess why animal cases might occur before human cases? They're outside, so they have different risk factors than what we have. And then human cases really considered to be the top of the activity. We actually have the environmental conditions. It's sunny Florida, right? We could have year-round transmission of some of these diseases. The environmental conditions are so good. Naturally, things tend to go up in the summer and go down in the winter, but technically we can have year-round transmission. And so for our sentinel chicken surveillance program, here's a picture of some cute chickens in a cage. Essentially, these are the mosquito control programs within these counties that currently participate. So there are 30 mosquito control programs in 28 counties that do this testing. And we don't have mosquito control in every single county in Florida to begin with. And even then, if you did have a mosquito control, it doesn't always necessarily cover your whole county. Like Nassau County, for example, not. I think it's just Amelia Island. Jacksonville, city of Jacksonville is pretty much where it's at. And so we have this sentinel chicken program, and then I mentioned that these flocks were throughout the state. And so serum is sent on a weekly basis to our state public health laboratory in Tampa, and they initially are doing a screening assay. So they're gonna do a hemagglutination inhibition assay, where they're looking for exposure in those chickens to either flaviviruses or to alpha viruses. And at that point, it's really just a screening test. So it's not necessarily going to tell you which one it is. And we'll do subsequently additional testing in order to try to sort that out. But because these birds are being submitted on a weekly basis, you're getting a lot of negative, 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 negative. And what you're looking for is that seroconversion where it's going from negative to positive, because that would be indication of recent virus transmission in that area. And of course, the more seroconversions you're seeing, the riskier things are. But again, it's Florida. We have really good environmental conditions. We can have year-round transmission of these diseases. And so it's not that exciting when we get positives because we expect there to be positives. So what we're really looking for is when do we have activity that's higher than what we would normally see at this time of year. And that's really the trigger for us to try to do more messaging to the public or to providers, things like that. And this is actually something that's been happening since the 1960s. So it's a long-standing program, and it doesn't look a whole lot different than what we do back then, but it's very similar assays and techniques as it started out with in the 1960s. And so first I'm going to talk a little bit about West Nile virus, but then try to reserve most of my talk for dengue and malaria, and then maybe throw in some Oropouche depending on how quickly I talk. For those of you who may not be familiar with West Nile virus, this one's being transmitted by the Culex species of mosquitoes. And depending on where you are in the United States, there may be different species of Culex involved. So in Florida, this one's really fun to say, so you guys can practice it and write it down, right? Culex quincunfasciatus and Culex nigripalpus are the ones that are kind of the vectors we would expect to have in Florida. There are some other species that may be involved, but these are the main players. And so humans can become infected, horses can become infected, some birds, and can all have this more clinical illness. But for most people who are exposed to West Nile virus, never develop any symptoms. It's really only about 20% of people who do. And most of the time, if you are going to develop symptoms, it's that kind of non-specific febrile illness that we hate, the AFI, where we can't really say one way or another, and the symptoms sound like everything else. But symptoms start about 3 to 14 days after a person is bitten by an infected mosquito. And that tip of the iceberg, the neuroinvasive ones that are the ones we are more likely to see, that meningitis, encephalitis, that's really only 1%, less than 1% of the cases that are out there. So very much the tip of the iceberg. About 10% of the people with the more neuroinvasive presentation will pass away. And then people over the age of 60, maybe those with organ transplants, things like that, underlying medical conditions, are all at more increased risk of that neuroinvasive presentation. And so at some point or another, every single county in Florida has had some type of West Nile virus transmission. And I guess you could probably tell on this map where the #1 county in the state is, right where we're standing right now. Sorry, guys. And that's a big jump up, right, between categories. But most of our West Nile activity is Central Florida and north. If we're having a really bad West Nile year, we can see transmission go into more South Florida, which is why Miami is in kind of that next highest level of color, because they had a really, really active year one year that put them on the map. But yeah, most of the time it's North Florida that more than anything else. And you guys have 2 cases right now, in case you were curious. And so the number of cases that we see in a given year really is like a roller coaster. It goes up and down. And a lot of that has to do with environmental conditions. It might have to do with bird immunity, because if a bird has West Nile, it's not going to get West Nile again. And lots of different potential factors at play. But hopefully what you can take away from this slide is the dark green, those neuroinvasive cases, are really the things that we're finding most often. Those lighter greenish colors are the ones that are more of that febrile illness. We kind of accidentally find those. Providers aren't always necessarily thinking West Nile if you just come in with a fever in the summertime. Some of those actually are people who may have screened positive on the blood bank test that's done nationwide for West Nile virus. And then you can actually go on to develop symptoms because the period of viremia is so short that sometimes people will test positive on the blood bank test and then have symptoms. And so that's what most of the lighter color actually are coming from. And then in red there are those asymptomatic blood donors that just screened positive and didn't actually develop any symptoms. But we still care about those because they're indicative of transmission in an area. So it doesn't matter if you have symptoms or not. If we get notified about someone, we are still following up on it. And then, of course, notifying mosquito control so that they can do their appropriate response activities too. And so I had mentioned that the sentinel chickens also kind of plays a role in this. Someone mentioned earlier that the horse cases are more at risk because they're outside. So same thing with the chickens, they're outside. Their risk is not necessarily going to equate to our risk. And so if you look at the percentage of those chickens that actually test positive for West Nile virus, a heavy year in chickens doesn't always equal a heavy year in people. And some of that has to do with, again, risk, but also different environmental factors where maybe the mosquitoes are feeling lazy and they want to stay with the birds and don't want to go over here where the people are. And so I'm just going to click through some quick examples of this just so that you can see with the actual numbers instead of the rate of where things kind of maybe aligned and didn't align. So when West Nile first came to Florida in 2001, you're seeing this kind of huge increase over time, just as it starts to become established. That was the worst year in 2003 right there. That's a lot of chickens for us. There's about 45,000 screening tests that gets done with chickens throughout the year. So that's an example of one that just did not match. That's another good one that didn't match. 2 humans, 800 chickens. So could it partially have been mosquito control doing a really good job? Yeah, that's also possibly it too. Okay. And that was all I wanted to say about West Nile, and really because you guys are the hotspots, so I wanted to talk about it. But now the things that I was actually asked to talk about are going to really focus on dengue and malaria, and I'm probably going to bounce back and forth between the two, but just so that you guys can get a sense of some trends in the data, but also like what it's like to actually investigate and follow up on these and different things we do to try to find them. So, I mentioned that West Nile virus, St. Louis encephalitis virus, and Eastern equine encephalitis viruses are the ones that are endemic to Florida, so normally found here. 95% of my time is actually spent on the ones that aren't from around here, which when I actually had to calculate that, I was really shocked that it was that bad. But yes, we spend much more of our time looking at dengue, chikungunya, Zika, now Oropouche. Maybe that 5% will get even less at this point. But this is really the biggest risk for us in kind of the longer term. Because at least we know West Nile, right? Some of these, like, they just come and then it's a whole new ball game and learning curve associated with it. And really, any of these ones where it can go back and forth between a person and the vector are the ones that are most at risk of being spread throughout the world. And that's because everything's just a plane ride away. So with increased globalization comes increased risk. And again, we have really good environmental conditions for these mosquitoes. Anyone want to hazard a guess on how many different mosquito species we have in Florida, just for fun? Lower. You like to go high. It's about 90. Not all of those can actually vector diseases, though. It's a much smaller number that can. A greater number of them are just those nuisance ones that are just really annoying, but can't give you diseases. So fun fact for the day. Okay. And again, I'm going to bounce back and forth between dengue and malaria, so don't hate me for that. So for dengue, this is an arbovirus. It's actually 4 different closely related serotypes, some people might call them, or viruses. Dengue 1, 2, 3, and 4. And when you've had, say, dengue 1, you are then immune to dengue 1 for the rest of your life. But you could still get dengue 2, 3, or 4, and then so on and so on and so on. And you're actually at more of an increased risk of having more severe disease if you've had dengue more than once, because your immune system remembers that you had dengue, and so it's going to over-respond and cause some havoc. So that would be things like severe shock or potentially some hemorrhagic manifestations. But for most people, you get kind of, again, this nondescript febrile illness that sounds like everything else. This is the most prominent arbovirus worldwide, so about 50 to 100 million cases, leading to 500,000 hospitalizations and 22,000 deaths. That's in contrast to malaria, which is the most common, really mosquito-borne disease pathogen altogether, not just the fact that it's a parasite. And so human malaria infections are really among 4 different parasites: Plasmodium falciparum, Plasmodium vivax, Plasmodium malariae, and ovale. There's been some talk that Knowles eye is another one. It's a non-human primate malaria, but can potentially cause some disease in people in Southeast Asia, it's been reported. Now, this is actually a completely different species of mosquitoes that are involved with transmission for this parasite. These are the Anopheles species. So these ones like to feed on a whole bunch of different stuff too. But nearly half of the world's population is at risk. And, this is from 2021, but 247 million cases and 619,000 deaths, with a lot of the deaths occurring in children under the age of 5. And because we like transmission cycles, I know you guys would like this one, right? I'm not going to go through the whole thing because that would be a lecture in and of itself. But what I want to point out is that there are multiple components to this transmission cycle that we have to worry about, and subsequently you guys worry about too. So we have just kind of like the initial cycle within the mosquito. That's going to be important for mosquito control activities to occur, to kind of understand the timing of something like that. Then we have kind of the human blood stages, when that's when the person is going to have a clinical illness, and that's when they're hopefully being diagnosed by you guys. And so then we also have the risk of having, infections with ovale and vivax can cause relapses because it likes to hide out in the liver. And so when we are doing our kind of case finding, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and case investigations and things like that, we need to think about all 3 of these parts, because if the person's not getting the right drug, for example, to treat for potential relapses, they can still relapse later on and be infectious to mosquitoes, and we could start a whole cycle over again of risk for local transmission. So it's too complicated, right? Not as simple as straightforward as we would like. And so Aedes aegypti, which is the primary vector for dengue, chikungunya, Zika, we actually can have statewide. It used to be primarily South Florida, and then another species, Aedes albopictus, was in North Florida, but now Aedes aegypti is kind of coming back and saying, I want the whole state, except for maybe like the Panhandle is mainly albopictus. But the primary malaria vector in Florida would be Anopheles quadrimaculatus. And so these species of mosquito actually have different preferences for just about everything. Aedes aegypti, that's more of your daytime biting mosquito. Quadrimaculatus, that's more of your nighttime biting mosquito. Aegypti likes to breed in small containers, can breed in like the amount of water that you have as a bottle cap is enough to have mosquito breeding occur. So you can imagine how hard that is for mosquito control to find all the places of little bottle cap amounts of water. Not fun. Anopheles quadrimaculatus, more of those like swampier kind of areas. And so mosquito control has to kind of think of what disease they're responding to, what are the mosquito vectors involved, and where are they breeding and things like that when they are doing their response activities. So it can be difficult. And then Floripush just makes it harder because there are multiple vectors and not just mosquitoes. And so they have differences similar like this, differences too. And because we are looking at diseases that are going back and forth between people and mosquitoes, that's all we got for trying to find cases. We don't have the rest of the tools in our toolbox. And looking for a positive mosquito is like looking for a needle in a haystack. I wouldn't recommend it. It would take you a lot of negatives before you would ever get a positive. In Puerto Rico, even at the height of their dengue outbreaks, they'll have one mosquito pool test positive in 1,000 that they're testing. So not really great odds for some of these exotic ones. But we have had positives in the past, but usually as we're kind of maybe responding to an outbreak. Looking at some trends over time, this is the travel-related cases, and I'm hoping that the biggest, I didn't put numbers on here on purpose. I'm hoping the biggest takeaway that you guys are getting is that malaria and dengue are our repeat offenders. We see travelers coming with these diseases every single year. Some years are worse, like 2022 is not a fun year. That was not a fun year. 2016, also not a fun year. But when, say, Zika or chikungunya was introduced into the Americas, they spread like wildfire because people had not been exposed to those diseases previously, so they did not have any immunity. And so we had a lot of cases in those first years, and they subsequently decreased. We actually haven't had a true Zika case since 2018. I'm always on the lookout, though. And again, this is in our travelers. And then chikungunya kind of just keeps petering along. But because you can get malaria more than once, because there's multiple dengue serotypes, so you could get it more than once, it allows for these ones to keep being transmitted, and they continue to be our #1 problem. But then some years you'll see 2022 for dengue, that year was almost as big as a Zika year. And it was because a new serotype of dengue that had not been in that area in a while in the Americas took off. So where are these cases coming from? So for dengue, our top 5 countries are all in the Caribbean. Really, the Americas are our #1 spot. We'll see some things from Asia, Africa, things like that, but nothing beats the Caribbean and nothing beats Cuba. It's just so close. We have so many people going back and forth. Cuba's our #1 spot. Like, Cuba is literally over 50% of our cases, and then the rest of these come in after that. So when we see large numbers of cases in Cuba, we have a problem because we know we're going to see a large number of cases. And so this is just showing over time that increase in cases in Cuba. We had a large outbreak in Cuba in 2022, and so 91% of the cases that we were counting that year had traveled to Cuba, which is a lot. And you can see from this one, the timing of when the serotypes switched. So dengue 1 and dengue 2 actually used to be our most common serotypes. And then in 2022, decided to flip our head to dengue 3. And then ever since then, dengue 3 has kind of been taking over. Looking at travel-related malaria cases, again, it kind of goes up and down, really dependent on what's happening in other areas. And then most of our travel-related cases are actually Plasmodium falciparum. And then about a quarter of them are maybe Plasmodium vivax. But one of the things that we've been noticing over time is that we're having this steady increase in the percentage of our Plasmodium vivax cases that are coming from Central and South America. So India used to be #1 for Plasmodium vivax, but it's switched. Most of our vivax cases are coming from the Americas. And the #1 reason why people are traveling to these countries and coming back with these diseases is because they're going home to visit their friends and relatives, the overwhelming majority. Looking at locally acquired cases, hopefully again, you can see dengue, man, almost every single year gets me. I got 2 years where I didn't have any, but other than that, every single year. Zika, of course, 2016 was a bad year, only had 2 cases in 2017, nothing since. And then we did have 7 locally acquired cases of malaria in 2023, which was the first time in 20 years that had been identified. These are the counties where we've had either dengue, chikungunya, or Zika. And one of the things I want to point out is that over the last 2 years, I added 7 counties to this list, which is crazy. I used to have more of a problem with South Florida, but this year in particular, Central Florida is like, don't forget about me. And you can see Volusia, we're working your way up to you guys. So don't forget it, you've got the right species of mosquitoes. In terms of local transmission for malaria, we have had cases just very sporadically, 1990, 2003, 2023. We also had a cryptic case here in Duval County in 2010 where we couldn't tell if it was acquired locally or if the person acquired it abroad. I think they were like a stewardess at an airline, so they had potential risk factors, but we couldn't nail it down. And then there's, of course, the risk for non-mosquito-borne transmission, too. So we've had some historical, maybe iatrogenic spread was thought, or we've had some transplants, too. And so when we're doing a human case investigation, we've got a lot of barriers before we even find out about a person, right? So the person has to get sick. We're not going to find out about those asymptomatic folks. They have to go to the doctor. The doctor has to think of the disease. They have to order the right test, and then it has to be reported to us. And so we do a lot of work to try to fill the gaps of where maybe people weren't thinking of the disease, or maybe they didn't order the quite right test. And that's why you guys are so important, because you can help fill those gaps too. And so one of the things I do is I look at everything and I say, does this actually make sense? Does the symptoms, the travel history, the testing, does it all make sense for that specific disease? And the timing is also super important, because we need to think about incubation periods. But because this is mosquito-borne stuff, we need to think about the incubation period in a person and the incubation period in a mosquito. So if I were to have a local case of dengue, 3 to 4 weeks after a traveler came back is like perfect, because then you're taking care of both types of the incubation periods. If it's too short, then that person wasn't the source of whatever the infection was. And so this is why we do really detailed case investigations, because we've had cases where the medical record said recent travel to Cuba. Well, my recent and your recent might not be the same thing. A month ago? No, that's not it. We're looking at 2 weeks here. We've had people who maybe lived in one county, but they were on vacation in another and actually got exposed there. So for us, travel history is super important. But we all know that testing is also extremely important. We wouldn't find out about cases if you guys didn't do the testing. So the timing, though, is everything. So during the course of the person's illness, the right test needs to be done at the right time. But we do have some issues, like with West Nile virus, for example, where you may have persistent detection of IgM antibodies for over a year. And that's where the timing of the symptoms comes into play, because then we can make sure, does it all make sense? In some cases, maybe they were tested too acutely and we need a second sample and see a seroconversion for us to say, yeah, that sounds good. But we also know that tests aren't perfect. We would love 100% sensitivity and specificity, right? But it's just not possible. We run into issues with cross-reactivity too, especially on those flaviviruses like to do that so much. Whenever we're doing West Nile testing, we actually do SLE testing too, because they are so very cross-reactive. And I think I'm gonna skip that one. But for the right test at the right time becomes really important for dengue, because most people go in about 4 days after their symptoms start, which is the perfect time for PCR. But if a provider orders serology, we're missing it, because they wouldn't be IgM positive within that first week or so. And so we actually follow up on people who are IgG positive for dengue, which could be a past infection. It could be a recent infection if they've had a past dengue exposure, because again, the IgG will be, yeah, I remember that dengue. It was a different serotype, but I still remember it. So we actually have those sent to our state lab if the person has had a recent febrile illness, and we'll do dengue PCR at the state lab. And so we've done a lot of work trying to educate providers to order dengue PCR. And between 2019 and 2022, our numbers got better. We started out with only 3% of our cases having commercial PCR positive results. Forward them to our state lab, 85% were PCR positive, which is crazy. In 2022, almost 29% of our cases, we wouldn't have counted as cases if we didn't do those extra activities. So one thing I ask of you all is check for your ordering system and make sure dengue PCR is an option to order. We did do a survey in South Florida looking to see, why maybe providers aren't ordering dengue testing. And sometimes they just didn't know which test to order, but sometimes they did know what test to order, but didn't actually order that test. We looked at some of the hospital labs, and some of the barriers they identified were, again, maybe that test code not being in the hospital system. Maybe they only sent to commercial labs that didn't actually have dengue PCR as a test option. So just something to keep in mind. And I think I'm gonna skip that one and go to malaria. So, and Kelly, don't give this away. I just want to do a quick case example with you guys. So it's 64-year-old homeless male presented to a hospital in Sarasota County and came with a 2-week history of fever, nausea, vomiting, and abdominal pain. Now, this hospital actually does manual reviews of their CBC differentials, and this is what they saw. Anybody? That's not Kelly?
Plasmodium vivax.
You got it, Plasmodium vivax. And so they reported that to the health department. We did our investigation. Lo and behold, the person did not have travel. And then you're like, are you sure it's 5X and not like Babesia or something, which we also don't have here, but nope, definitely Plasmodium vivax, and was PCR positive for Plasmodium vivax when tested at CDC and at our state lab. So at that point, we knew we had a problem, right? I know you all know malaria diagnostics, so I'm not going to belabor the point, but it's important for you guys to have the ability to review those blood smears, to get those results within 24 hours, and just to have the ability to diagnose someone, because Plasmodium falciparum, for example, that's no joke. That can knock a person dead pretty quickly. So having the ability to do rapid tests, which the hospital in Sarasota County actually did have the ability to do a rapid test, and it came positive for non-Plasmodium falciparum. So led credence to Vivex as well in that regard. And then, of course, most of the PCR testing isn't being done at the hospitals. It's send out tests, so that can lead to delays. And treatment delays are not what we want. Thankfully, none of our local cases had any severe malaria, but it's important to think of the blood stage treatment, like I mentioned earlier, but also that anti-relapse treatment. One of our 7 local malaria cases actually had a relapse despite taking Primaquine, so there's that potential risk too. So when we get notified of someone without travel, we are doing a full investigation. We're interviewing people, we're looking at medical records, but we also have some additional tools in our toolbox just to help us find what we can find, because we want to leave no stone unturned. And so some of the things we're doing is maybe we're looking at your hospital's chief complaints and discharge diagnoses of people going into the emergency department. That's one of the things that we do. And we look to see maybe the word dengue, or maybe we're looking for the word malaria, or different combinations of symptoms to say, oh, you know, hospital person, did this person get tested for dengue? They have the classic symptoms, and it says travel to Cuba in here. And then, you know, try to arrange testing if say it didn't. We've also been trying to do some more sequencing in-house to try to get at the greater questions of just what are the dynamics of transmission of some of these diseases, and try to look at relatedness. We're doing a lot of mapping. Every case that gets reported to us, we are looking to see, are you close to another case? Does this person have travel? Does this person not have travel? And then in some instances, we might be doing that shoe leather epidemiology of going door to door. It's been a little while since we've had to do that, but thankfully haven't had to do it recently, and I'm good with that, because that's a lot of work. And I think I'm going to skip this one just because that goes into way more detail. And so when we're looking for like different symptom combinations, I just want to show you some examples of what we see on our end of what symptoms a person maybe said they had, and then what the diagnoses that came from the doctor looked like. And these were all actually our local malaria cases. And so we were looking for things like fever, thrombocytopenia, anemia, abdominal pain, sepsis, splenomegaly. Those were all things that kept looking out for us. I know this is Zika, and I'm not supposed to be talking about Zika on this call, this presentation, but I just really like this example for the mapping piece. So it's really important that we think of not only where a person lives, but where do they work too? Because we're spending most of our time at work than anything else, right? And so at this time when this map was made, there were 4 local cases, 2 in Miami-Dade County and 2 in Broward County. And had we not actually gotten the work locations for the individuals that were involved, we wouldn't have found that one Broward case and one Miami case worked right next door to each other. So that was actually in Wynwood, in our first active area of Zika virus transmission that was identified. We went to one of those businesses, tested additional people. There were a lot of people that were positive at that business. Then we went out in the community door to door testing people. And again, found additional people who were actually asymptomatic, and we would have never found those people because they wouldn't have gone to a doctor. So that was just a fun aside. Whenever we have local cases, we're really amping up our public health response, especially when it comes to outreach. So especially for this malaria investigation, we had several cases that were homeless. And so the need to do outreach to homeless coalitions, other organizations that are maybe serving unhoused persons and things like that, trying to make sure that the public is aware so that they can, be engaged to take the right mosquito-borne precautions. Advisories and alerts to the public we do based on the activity that we're seeing, and then of course to the healthcare providers in the area. Thankfully, I don't have to do any of the media stuff. I can just like play with data and look at cases all day. And so looking at kind of the timeline, because we love timelines and epi curves as epidemiologists, of our local malaria cases last year, there was actually an imported case that lived in the area a couple of weeks before our first case. Unfortunately, that one was not one that we were able to do PCR and get sequencing on, so we couldn't say that they were the source, but it's possible. They came from the right country where the sequencing of the malaria isolates, or the right region, because it was basically shown that it was likely introduced from Central or South America. Okay, so we have our first case that was homeless. There's another case there in blue that was homeless, and our third case that was homeless. So if you recall, these are nighttime biters. Homeless individuals are spending a lot of time outside, so they would certainly be a risk group that we would be concerned about. This was a case where mosquitoes were tested for the disease, or for the parasite in this case, and we actually had 3 positive, and nothing ever happens at a good time, right? So like I got the phone call from CDC that we had 3 positives at like 4 p.m. on a Friday. Like just don't answer the phone at 4 p.m. on a Friday. And they're like, you have 3. And I'm like, no, I expect 0. Like we're just sending these in so that we can say that they were negative. Like, no, there were really 3. And instead of testing a pool like of multiple mosquitoes like we normally do, CDC was actually testing them individually, painfully testing them individually, because they were dissecting the mosquito and trying to see, detect the parasite in the midgut of the mosquito versus the salivary glands. The DNA being in the midgut would mean that the mosquito had fed upon an infected person. Finding the parasite in the salivary glands would mean that that mosquito was infectious and could have infected someone at that point. But yeah, that was like so many mosquitoes, too many mosquitoes. But anyway, the mosquitoes were detected when we were seeing the highest number of cases at that time. And this was all within maybe like a 4-mile area. Okay. Oh. And then that first asterisk was when we were able to issue a mosquito-borne illness advisory. We try not to do an advisory until we have all of our ducks in the row, so we know that the person definitely didn't travel. We've done the confirmatory testing to say, yes, this is definitely Plasmodium vivax, and we make sure that all of our partners are aware too before we go, yay, look what we found. And then this is when we were able to issue a mosquito-borne illness alert after we identified the additional cases. And really, the rest of the cases were found because of the engaged providers and the engaged laboratorians that were reviewing these at the local hospitals. But one of the things that we found in the course of the investigation is not every hospital could actually do that manual blood smear review. And a lot of them were sending them off-site. So that, I know you guys do it all right? But just something to keep in mind that those traditional skills are still very useful. So when you need money, you tell people that, right? In terms of the mosquito control response, when we have, this is from one of the dengue outbreaks that we had, they're going door to door. They are using all of the tools in their toolbox, whether it's spraying with things like on their backpack. Some of them might have trucks. Florida Keys is really very rich, so they have helicopters that they fly around to do the spraying. So they're a well-funded program. Their taxpayers help them out a lot. But it could be as simple as just draining standing water on your property. I think I'll skip that one, but really just the key points I want to make are that we couldn't do any of this without you guys. Helping to make sure that the right testing is ordered and that these diseases are considered, and just having the ability to do these diagnoses just to begin with promptly. And then, of course, the public health reporting is the number one thing for us too, so that we can then do our response activities, and mosquito control can do theirs. But whenever we do have a locally acquired case, it really is this concerted effort between everybody, because we can't, operate in a vacuum. It's just impossible. And especially that close coordination with mosquito control too. Even if there was a county that didn't have, say, a mosquito control, during, we had a dengue outbreak in Hardee County last year, which is not where I would have picked if I was going to have one. I don't know if anyone's ever been to Hardee County. It's like this rural, middle of nowhere area. We had 20 dengue cases, and that's a lot for that population. The mosquito control that was actually in a neighboring county came over and sprayed for them because they didn't have the resources locally. So everything is just, it's always great when people help each other out, but it is all close coordination and a concerted effort between everybody. And I managed to get done with 15 minutes left for questions, or I could talk about Oropouche, or you could ask me about Oropouche. I'm happy for all of the above. Thank you guys. And I will also note that I can do this lecture for 3 hours too, so this was just a taste. You're not going to invite me back, but it was a taste. Yeah.
Mosquito control, do they do this go out and do it, or do you have to call them and ask them to come spray in your area if you've got a large population or standing water?
A little bit of both. So there are actually statutes in the Florida statutes that kind of govern when mosquito control can spray and what levels of mosquito activity there has to be for them to spray. So some mosquito control programs, I think most of them actually have usually like an online complaint form or something like that that you can fill out and say, hey, these mosquitoes are driving me nuts, like please come help me. They actually can't spray until they verify that what you said is a problem is a problem. So they end up putting out a trap, and if it meets the threshold of a certain number of species or number of mosquitoes in the trap, then they can go ahead and do their response activities. In some cases, they may be like, hey, I see you've got some breeding here, let's tip it over and do some education at the same time. But if we are notifying the mosquito control program to say we have a case of X, Y, and Z at this location, the actual statutes were recently changed in the last year that they don't need to wait to verify that there are X number of mosquitoes in a trap. They can actually go and do some sort of control activities whenever we tell them that there's a public health need to. Yeah.
The map that Dade and Broward does not have mosquito control?
They do have mosquito control. We would be in big trouble if they didn't. So they're one of the few counties that have had dengue, chikungunya, and Zika, all three. And let's hope our fingers that cross our fingers that that Oropouche doesn't get added to that list. But yeah, South Florida is just because they have such a high percentage of people who are non-born in the United States and are going back and forth to these areas visiting their friends and relatives, they're just at a much higher risk. But then you have things like Volusia County where it's just kind of like a freak accident happened, so you never know. But yeah, Miami beats everybody else when it comes to the number of locally acquired cases. Yeah. Yeah, so the chemicals that are used are really going to vary because they have to target the right species of mosquitoes and the right type of habitat that those mosquitoes are breeding. And also looking at, are you trying to kill the mosquito larvae or are you trying to kill the adult mosquito? So there's a lot of different factors involved. And then the next questions are, they can only use pesticides that are registered in the state of Florida type things as well. So there's a lot of moving parts when it comes to that. Insecticide resistance is another huge thing. Most of the pesticides that are used in the United States are actually for agricultural purposes. And so mosquito control makes up like this much, hopefully the camera, that much, of what pesticide use is actually for in the United States. And so insecticide resistance is a real thing. And so a lot of the mosquito control programs will actually test their mosquitoes to see if they're resistant to certain products. And they rotate their products as well in order to try to avoid those types of things from happening. Because you don't want to have just one tool in your toolbox and then you're in trouble. They're going to all be different. Most of them are going to be spraying routinely, and they actually spend more of their time on those nuisance mosquitoes that, like, if you're next to a salt marsh, I'm sorry. you're not getting diseases from there, but you're getting hammered by mosquito bites. So they actually spend more time on salt marsh mosquitoes than disease vector mosquitoes, just because of the public or the taxpayers are the ones paying for mosquito control activities. So it kind of shifts towards like where it's needed the most. But yeah, they all have different capacities, and some might not even spray at all. It really depends on budget and what the need is. Anybody? That's a good question. I can't see the chat. Yeah.
Travel and positivity and increase in positivity, take into consideration the non-travel after COVID, it seemed like there was very little, and then all of a sudden.
And so that probably helps too. We actually had a dengue outbreak in the Florida Keys during COVID. And I think COVID helped us and hurt us because people weren't bringing it elsewhere really, but people were spending a lot more time outside too. So they were all hanging out in their backyards, and then the whole neighborhood was getting dengue. But then like during COVID, our malaria travelers decreased too. So I think COVID helped us where people couldn't go to these countries as much anymore. But then as soon as people could travel back home, that has certainly helped to increase the numbers right back to where they were before, if not higher. Let's see if there's any in the chat.
Maybe you just give us a
No
little
questions
bit
in
of
the chat.
overview about Oropuche.
Yeah.
Say the word.
Oh gosh, there's 3 different ways.
I mean, probably everyone at the state lab has, but
Yeah, so I'm going with Orapooch, though I may sometimes digress into other versions. So Orapooch, Orapooch, Oropuche, all completely valid. It's actually an arbovirus that's been around for a long time. It was first identified in the 1950s in Trinidad. And most of the cases historically have been in the Amazon basin of South America. But this past year, early in 2024, there was a large outbreak of Oropouche virus in Brazil, Peru, Colombia, missing one. Oh, it's Cuba. Yeah, I'll get to Cuba in a minute. But they were seeing large numbers of cases, and there were actually over 8,000 cases that were reported. And so with this one, it takes like both of those transmission cycles I showed you, and it lumps them together and then adds a whole nother species of vector. There's kind of like this jungle sylvatic cycle where sloths are thought to serve as the source of the virus, and it can go back and forth between sloths and then mosquitoes and biting midges, those no-see-ums that are also really annoying. But when it somehow escapes that, maybe someone has gone and visited the jungle, goes back home to their city in Brazil, and then you can have more urban spread. That can actually go from person to vector. So those mosquitoes were biting midges. So it's actually the same mosquito vector as West Nile virus. And then the biting midges we have here in Florida, we actually have 50 species of them, kind of like the mosquitoes. There's a lot. So not every species can transmit, but we do technically have the Chilocoides paraensis that can transmit in Florida. And so it causes a really dengue-like illness, which makes it hard because it sounds like everything else. And when it hit Cuba, we knew we were in trouble because, again, Cuba equals South Florida for us. And so not a whole lot had really been looked at for this virus since the 1950s because it kind of stayed in its spot, and it had outbreaks every now and then, but it wasn't like super common outside of the Amazon region. And so Cuba actually doesn't report how many cases they have, but we anticipate that it's pretty widespread. And so what we did was we looked at our cases that sounded like dengue clinically to us, but maybe didn't test positive for dengue, and looked to see, hey, could this have been Oropouche? And then CDC right now is the only one that has the testing for it, which doesn't help either. But hopefully we'll have it soon. Don't quote me on that. But essentially, we actually have identified so far, just from looking at those dengue negatives, we identified 48 travel-related cases. And so I'm kind of looking at that as being the tip of the iceberg too. That one is a bit more complicated because it historically hasn't been shown to cause deaths, but there's already been a couple of deaths reported in Brazil. There's also been potentially shown some risk to pregnant women. There's been some fetal deaths, some possible microcephaly. So like clinically, it's like trying to give us Zika vibes in that regard. Um, and it seems like maybe there had been some sort of mutation in the virus that kind of allowed it to maybe act a little bit differently than what we normally see. But I think that still needs a little bit more work. But that's going to be the next one that's probably going to be on everybody's radar, and lots of testing requests and all that fun stuff. But yeah, the risk to pregnant women definitely bumps it up higher on our radar too. But yeah, we've already found travel related cases, and hopefully no local cases, but we keep trying to do our best. Yeah. Anything you want to add to that?
Well, I'll just say the reality of there being more cases and possibly local cases, we don't really know because access to testing at this point is so limited.
Very
It has to
limited.
be a healthcare provider that's like, these are the symptoms, it's not dengue. Probably contacting the health department or you doing surveillance and it being on your radar.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, CDC is the only one that can do diagnostic testing at the moment.
We've only had a handful of providers that maybe reached out directly to ask us for the Oropouche testing. For the most part, it's been doing like our normal dengue activities of trying to find cases and then just co-opting it for Oropouche. So I am sure the numbers are much higher than what we're actually picking out.
It's a PRNT, the
Right.
assay that they're doing at the moment. So it's a 2-week turnaround time from CDC, but their PCR is live today.
I saw that. I was very excited because, man, is it hard to do things without PCR when everyone goes acutely. And then one thing I didn't mention is you can also have relapses in symptoms. So like it'll seem like you got better, then you'll get sick again, but you're not viremic again. So it makes it harder for us to even pick which tests to do because we need to know the person's whole progression and the timeline for everything. But yeah, the PRNT is not the fastest, and because it wasn't very high on people's radar until we have an outbreak, right? There's no IgM tests, there's no commercial testing, and the PCR is officially live today. Woo. But yeah, if you did have anyone that your providers were considering, you would just reach out to your county health department, and then they would ask me for approval, and then I would say yes or no, and we would go from there.